Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay. Welcome, Austin and Jim. It's that time of year for us to do our annual update. Jim, in my mind, the biggest story this last year is China. We've got protests in China. We've got China, their Belt and Road Initiative still going. We've got concentration camps in China. We've got China espionage. We've got China trade wars. A lot of the stories this year have rotated around China. What's your thoughts on that?
Oh, it's been a bad year for China. The problem is they had a lot of problems that have been stalking them, as it were. And as Murphy's Law puts it, all things happen at once when you least expect it, and that's what happened. I mean, Hong Kong was a minor problem. They've had outbreaks before, but now it's sustained. It's been going on for 6 months now. The thing up in the northwest with the Turks, with the Muslims, that's something they thought they had under control until it got a lot of publicity. They really thought they were solving that problem because they had the Muslim states they did business with, cowed, as it were. The Chinese, have a different attitude towards that. And they did, the Muslim states said, well, do we ruin our profitable business relationship with China, or do we come down on them for, persecuting our fellow, Muslims or Turks or whatever? Well, now it's coming out. On the plus side, they haven't had any more terrorism, and they did have some. But that clampdown, I mean, hey, nothing like throwing all the males in prison for a couple of months every year to shut down the unrest. But, when it's happening in Hong Kong, and that at the same time the United States launches its long-feared trade war, counterattack for all the industrial espionage, the cyber war, the basically cheating on the trade deals, that's coming home to roost. And at the bottom of all, underlying all this, is the weakness of the Chinese economy. In other words, it couldn't come at a worse time. They're sitting on the mountains of bad debt. This is similar to a situation the Japanese had in the 1990s, and the Japanese still haven't recovered from that. Speaking of the Japanese and the South Koreans, with their plummeting populations, because once people become affluent, the women say, well, I don't have to have a bunch of kids, maybe not at all. That's going all through Europe. And now the Chinese find that the 3 decades of the one-child rule, it means they're running into labor shortages and a surplus of old folks. And they have a ramshackle, social security system, so to speak. And it's really bad for morale if you got a lot of the old folks suffering. So that's something else that's sneaking up on them. But mainly it's the financial system. I mean, that, as we pointed out before, that's why they haven't cracked down real hard on Hong Kong. But Hong Kong may be, self-destructing of its own volition, because I keep hearing, I do business with people over in Japan, and they're talking about getting a lot of, chatter, as it were, from their contacts in Hong Kong. A lot of people are getting out or updating their plans to get out, get a second passport somewhere else. And that's going to hurt them real bad, because they can't easily replace that. Even with the special relationship and everything, what made Hong Kong special was that it basically played by Western rules, business rules. The rest of China, you had to have the right contacts. You go to the local courts, and it depends on who the judge is buddies with. And a lot of people are bailing out of China. Shutting down factories, moving them elsewhere, big time. This is a huge thing. Now, this was a long time coming, because there was this labor shortage in China. Labor rates have been rising, and it suddenly people did the numbers and they said, it's cheaper to go to Vietnam or Cambodia or Thailand or what have you, and those countries who are never on great terms with China because China is the local hegemon, as it were, the local empire, and the empire is restless and seeking to rectify borders and claim unoccupied territory, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of Schadenfreude, quiet joy at the problems China is having, and it's payback time. That's where the Belt and Road is running into problems because that Belt and Road is run with a lot of individual entrepreneurs. There are government support, financial and otherwise, for the Belt and Road Initiative, but the local deals are made with Chinese companies that are really aren't under the tight control of the state, and they basically go for the best deal for them. And of course, the locals say, "See, that's China looking out for the best thing for China." But it's just a bunch of savvy businessmen, out to make what they can off the locals, and the locals have wised up to that. And a lot of these deals are stalled. They're in renegotiation. We've reported on that as far as Thailand goes because there was a lot of them trying to run their way through Thailand, and the Thais forced them to renegotiate several times into more advantageous terms for the Thais. Same thing in Burma. So China is basically having a rough time. In fact, something else, I don't know if we put this bit out there yet on their naval budget. They've had to cut back on the naval budget. The government was never happy about the Navy demanding more money, more ships, overseas bases. China had never done that before. They were always a continental power. So this is totally alien to them. But the admirals pointed out, look, we're now, for the first time in our history, we're dependent on imports. This was never the case before. And what they're most dependent upon is oil. They are the biggest importer of oil. They try to develop local resources, but they can't. They're buying natural gas from Russia, but that's going slowly. You got to build the pipelines. So at the moment, the Chinese are in bad shape, and they basically told the admirals, you're not going to have a big carrier fleet anytime soon. So they're apparently going to stop at 4. And the Liaolang, the first one, the one that's the old converted Russian carrier, is going to be turned into a combat ship as well as a training ship. That's another problem they have, and we've been reporting this, is that they've had problems, a lot of problems. Niggly little stuff. I mean, you think we're having problems with the Ford and, the new replacement for the Nimitz-class carriers. Well, the Chinese have had it a lot worse. And they've also had problems getting crews. Again, the labor shortage. The new generation coming up, they don't really have conscription. Technically, they have conscription, but basically the Chinese military has been all volunteer for a long time. But now, when you can get a good job, in the civilian, area, especially educated people, they simply don't want to join, especially the Navy. The Army, you get to stay in one place, be with a family, et cetera, et cetera. But the Navy is all about, taking these long voyages, going to, basically being away from home for a long time. And they're not getting the young officers they need for a carrier fleet, especially. It's not just the carriers, but you got about 10 other combat and support ships that got to go along with it, especially since these are oil-powered carriers. They require a lot more oilers to accompany them if they're going to stay out there for any length of time. And they did the numbers, and they said, look, it's just not adding up for us. And now with the Americans, beating us against the beating us up and upside the head about, trade, we cannot afford to basically pay for all this oil and pay for other imports and support this big Navy. So the big Chinese Navy is on hold for a while. But anyway, yes, in general, it's been a bad year for China. But actually, it's been a good year for the rest of the world. Overall trends in terms of violence. I mean, China has always been a potential threat. They're building a bigger saber and rattling it, but they haven't actually fired on anybody yet. They're all what they might do, could do. But in the places where there is a war going on, it's gone down. The peak year for what we call terrorism-related deaths was 2014, where it was about 35,000. This year, it's down from that peak by about 2/3. And in 2018, it shrank 15%, and it looks like it's shrinking more this year. That is, and a lot of this terrorism is not really terrorism; it's just local conflicts with a veneer of Islamic defending Islam. Usually, it's defending Islam from fellow Muslims, but that's another story. So you have Syria settling down. There'll be one more massacre up in Idlib province, where the last bunch of Islamic terrorist groups are. In fact, I did an update. We haven't published it yet about the more details about the Baghdadi raid that took him out. It turns out we got a lot of valuable information from the various factions that Baghdadi thought he was safe with inside of Idlib province. He had a number of safe houses there, but there are a lot of people who didn't like ISIL. Basically, they don't do this out loud, like they blame the United States for everything, but they're blaming ISIL for a lot of their woes. I mean, ISIL to a lot of Muslims is an enemy of Islam, a threat, and indeed it was. And ISIL is still operating, but they've had a lot of people who are basically going back to their former groups in Idlib province. This was other Al-Qaeda type operations, and the Kurds and the Turks have informants and Syrians too have informants in Idlib province. They can get information out of. Cell phones are wonderful, and they basically got some of the key tips that allowed us to pinpoint where Baghdadi was and carry out that raid successfully. And that's going to pay us dividends going in the future, because any place where ISIL is operating, there are more and more disaffected ISIL members who are, again, willing to do the unthinkable, 5 years ago, and that is rat out, the caliphate. The other problem is, and again, we're getting back to future wars, we still have problems with what I call the failing or failed states. In fact, we have the wars update this year is going into the confluence, as it were, of the many different factors which produce a failed or failing state, and that means high corruption, low social welfare, and basically, an abundance of terrorism. And of course, it's not always terrorism for religious purposes. A classic example, which we've been covering regularly for years, is the Fulani people. That's an ethnic group of tribes, as it were. There's about 20 million of them, I think, throughout Africa. They're one of the Sahel, the semi-desert area below the Sahara that transitions into, hit the Niger River and basically tropical Africa, where there's more water. They've been moving down because there's been a population explosion in Africa, actually ever since the 20th century, when modern medicine got in there. Something they don't talk about, the colonial occupation. It basically was great for lowering poverty and increasing the population. But anyway, the Fulani have been the most aggressive. Now, they're still killing a lot of people, often fellow Muslims, because they are farmers, and they won't let the Fulani move in and graze their herds and basically share the water and what have you. And we report on that regularly and extensively in Nigeria. In fact, most of the deaths for the last 2 years, violence-related, violence, terrorism, non-religious and religious terrorism deaths in Nigeria have been due to the Fulani, and most of them are not religion-based. I mean, a lot of it when it's Muslim against Muslim, it's basically the herders, the stockmen, Fulani versus Muslim farmers, and religion becomes immaterial when you want pasture and water. So that's something that's going to basically hurt Africa. Africa, as we point out and have pointed out in the past, has a lot of failing states because they never had a lot of states in Africa before the 19th century, before the 20th century, because when the colonial powers went in, they established states or colonies where there was no nation, as it were, before, just collections of tribes. The tribes have been disappearing slowly. 60 years ago, 50 years ago, there was about 1,000 different ethnic groups in Africa. Now it's down to close to 500 and shrinking. In other words, like in Europe and the rest of the world, China, everywhere, the tribal culture eventually disappeared to be replaced by a nation state or a kingdom, as it were. That is happening in Africa, but it happens very slowly. And that's something else we point out. Afghanistan. People say, well, we should get out of Afghanistan and, somehow we won't have any problems. Well, you'll have the same problem we had before. We've always had when there's not a united Afghanistan, united in terms of one tribe is allowed to deal with the foreigners, and they basically stay out of trouble with the foreigners, which is not 100%, but just enough so the foreigners don't say we got to go in there and burn the place down. It was fairly stable, and it was that way, throughout the 18th, 19th, and into the 20th century. But now you've got the religious angle, and basically you've got the support of Pakistan. Pakistan is the main reason you had the Taliban in Afghanistan. Now, that's something people have only started to realize. We recognized it, over a decade ago, well, 2 decades ago, when we started, we were reporting Pakistan was always involved in in basically supporting the Islamic terrorists in Afghanistan. And the Pakistanis, they say, well, we have to have influence in Afghanistan. They consider Afghanistan a threat. Now, historically it is. There's a mountain range up there called the Hindu Kush. This goes way back before Islam got into India. And Hindu Kush literally means, in the local language, death to Hindus. In other words, the people up there in Afghanistan, they felt it was their right to periodically, when they had a couple of years of good crops and what have you, and the population got fat and happy and greedy, they would go down and invade. They go through the corridor through what is now Pakistan, and then into Kashmir and into northern India, and that's been going on for thousands of years. And when people say Afghanistan's never been conquered, that's not true. In the past, when the Silk Road was there, portions of it were occupied for centuries by either the Persians and the Hindus. The Chinese never sent armies that far, but the Silk Road was good for everybody as long as it remained open. And one of the big problem areas was Afghanistan. And so for centuries, it was money. It was the economic need of larger adjacent empires that basically kept Afghanistan largely occupied, pacified, and profitable. But there's nothing worth economic sense there anymore, unless you count heroin, which most countries don't, including the local nations who have suffered the side effects of having millions of addicts, which everybody agrees is a bad thing. So Afghanistan is a problem that's not going to go away easily. You can say we're going to get out, and our government is trying to negotiate a deal with the Taliban. But the big problem is they have to deal with Pakistan, and Pakistan says, well, we're not really involved. So the problem there is more complicated because the people who are most responsible for the problem in the first place deny that they're responsible. You can see what we're getting into here. It's a problem not because of the people on the ground, but their neighbors. Even the Iranians are willing to basically stay out of Afghanistan. They've got enough problems at home, even in the best of times. But the Pakistanis feel, again, a nation that was created after the British left Southern Asia, and it's never really settled down. And now that's recognized. I mean, Pakistan is now, the UN has agreed. All right, yes, they're supporters of international terrorism. They're under various economic sanctions or threatened sanctions that you get hit with if you're nailed as officially as a supporter of international terrorism. They're basically sliding close to it. And in the meantime, Pakistan is going broke, because the army controls much of the economy and a lot of the politics. So that is a problem that has been there for a long time, and there's no quick fix to it. So overall, the violence worldwide is going down, but the hot spots, I mean the hot spots, are places like Pakistan. You've also got the Persian Gulf with Iran and the Gulf Arabs. But again, people there pay attention to the money. As I always point out to people, you want to find out where the problem is, follow the money. You can basically avoid those problems up to a point, but after a while, as they're finding out in Iran, where they're having, they've had 2 years of on and off, major demonstrations, which are getting more and more violent and more insistent that the Islamic government has to go. So you're basically faced. There's a possibility of another civil war in Iran, which has a history of civil wars among the Iranians going back thousands of years. I mean, that's how Alexander the Great managed to, destroy, conquer Persia, because they had a string of civil wars. They were weakened. The Greeks, were strong militarily. They were ambitious, and they just went in and performed a miracle. Well, it really wasn't a miracle. Once you start digging into the details, you find out there was a reason for why it happened. And some of those reasons, like most things in history, are coming around again.
Austin, what's your take on 2019?
Well, go back to China. I do think China's been a major story, but China's problems are long in the making. It's like, go look at Deng Xiaoping's opening and reform, which set off the Chinese economic revolution. He also had the 4 cardinal principles, which basically enshrined party control. In other words, a dictatorship of the party, which would allow to a large degree economic expansion and the appearance of economic freedom, but kept down the political kept the political clamps on the entire country. And they played off the perception that, no, we're Chinese. The wealthier they get, they'll still kowtow if the party demands it, if the emperor demands it. And Xi Jinping, start of this decade, starts making his move to solidify power in one person, himself. That occurs effectively really 2013, but you could see it coming starting 2010 with a solidification of his personal power. And so now you're in a situation where you have yes men telling you what you want to hear because you're so powerful. And you're going to run the economy like that? I'm sorry. Yeah, you go back to the benefit of free enterprise. Forget capitalism. That's made up to compare as if it were a system run from the top down, like socialism is. You have all these little errors in both systems, but the little errors get corrected in free enterprise because you've got individuals running their own businesses. For the most part, they don't build up. In China, they've been building up, just like they did in the Soviet Union, and then they clash with Hong Kong. Exemplifies that clash between political and freedom and free enterprise, and the kind of pseudo-free enterprise and authoritarianism, and not outright totalitarianism, you have in the People's Republic. Same kind of issue permeates the issue of Taiwan, which, the lost province, according to Beijing. And it's becoming what it was prior to, let's say, 2005, when it moderated for a bit. The Taiwan Strait situation is a frozen war again. You can make an argument that it was never not a frozen war. But what's gone on in Hong Kong has reinforced Taiwan's will to resist, and even stoked a larger percentage of the people on the island who want independence from China, or they'll get, and this is the way I've heard it expressed, of course it's in English, they'll get Hong Konged, meaning they'll get undermined in the way that the Sino-British treaty that set the rules on Hong Kong, supposedly set the rules on Hong Kong, has been eroded by Red China, really starting since 2002, 2003, and the people of Hong Kong could see it. Now, why I'm going into this in more detail than Jim did is that this is one of the many problems that China faces. They just thought that they had the communists thought they had it under control, and Hong Kong tells them that they don't. And if they can put two People's Armed Police mech divisions in Shenzhen right across the border, and they still hadn't cowed Hong Kong. They've got intelligence agents inside Hong Kong, and they still haven't calmed it down. And one of the things that to look for, the claims are that it's already occurred, is sympathy for Hong Kong throughout the rest of Guangdong province, where Canton is. It is a canton, the Guangdong, which has, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Jim, I believe I'm right. I think it still has the highest per capita income.
Yes,
as a province, and Dan, yeah, I know. Yes, it's a yes plus, because that's throughout the entire province. You have these other highly successful in terms of income locations around Shanghai, Beijing, some other places associated with information technology, universities, and the like, and governmental institutions, research institutions. But Guangdong sits there because it's really got a closer to a modern economy, and it has had the free enterprise import and export connection right there with Hong Kong. And so that's, again, would the Reds, communists, kill the golden goose? They were in the process of strangling it, because the authoritarian impulse, the four cardinal principles, was it still in control of opening and reform. I'm being a little bit glossy with that, but you go back and look at the contradictions right there when Deng Xiaoping issued his, we're going to modernize, and he used Zhou Enlai as a resource on it, because Zhou had said at one of the party congresses, I think it was 75, that we had to catch up in terms of economic and military modernization, and it was obvious that they had to. So when Deng takes over, he says that here's the great foreign minister and Mao's right hand man had blessed this. That's smart politics. But he had, at the same time, Deng says, no, the cardinal principles of the party remains in control. Now, that's at the social and political level, moves into the economics as well. Jim talked about some of the other issues they've had with their military. I would say, too, that last year, but definitely this year, Beijing came to the realization that their artificial island program in the South China Sea, their strategy of bilateral bullying. In other words, we're going to beat up on Vietnam, we're going to beat up on the Philippines, we're going to beat up on Malaysia, we'll beat up on Indonesia, and buy off Cambodia, all on our own. It's us against one, and then it might be us against three small nations. But the U.S., it's not that we weren't backing them, but we were belated, very belated, in objecting to the militarization, the imminent militarization of those islands. They were completely false and fake. In 2016, the Hague Arbitration Court ruled that China had violated the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS treaty, when they really invaded with construction barges and Coast Guard vessels the Philippines exclusive economic zone and built one of these islands. And the Philippines filed charges on them. I think it was 2013 officially, and the ruling comes out in 2016, and the Philippines gets 98% or 99% of what of their claim, including illegal fishing, theft, and China just ignores it. And what does the United States do? Well, we start at the time using the Shangri-La Defense Conference to try to form a coherent political and quasi-military defense organization out of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. We've increased we began increasing, this is 2014, 2015, operations in the South China Sea with Australia. And some up with Japan. Japan is now running its own patrols in the South China Sea. But it was all until really 2017, and that's a new administration, by the way. China was still pushing. They thought that they had the money, they had the political prowess. The United States was weak and in retreat. And not only did we start showing what the Quad, as it's called, had been building. That the Quad is Japan, Australia, U.S., and India. That China's bullying had moved India into a quasi alliance with the United States and Japan. They had already had an alliance, bilateral or trilateral, with Singapore and Australia, effectively in terms of military cooperation. So now that's huge pushback. I know we're talking about 2019, and you can say, wait a minute, Austin, that Quad is really appearing in 2017 and 2018. Yeah, but I think it hardens up this year. We're now officially, it's no longer Pacific Command, PACOM, it's Indo-Pacific Command. That's another how to clamp on China is what that amounts to. And Jim covered the trade war aspect. The U.S. trade war has not only done more to produce to begin to produce a fair trade regimen between the United States and China. It's shown China how economically fragile it is, and that's is that a war? I think it is, Dan. I think it certainly counts as a conflict, and it's something that has had degrading effects on China's ability to use its power to bully other nations in the region. And it's given, I think, Beijing second thoughts about how their authoritarian model was going to replace, I know this is made up, but this is something they used, the liberal international order, which was kind of their latest term for the post-World War II trading system, largely policed by the U.S. Navy, and policed in a in a benign fashion. And I say policed by the U.S. Navy, meaning that free trade on the seas is guaranteed and protected and not and recognized. And the U.S. Navy being the largest naval and international naval force, even though you could easily see another 30 nations that with naval power to support it. I've concentrated on China. Jim went worldwide. There's a recent column of mine where I talked about protests and extended protests through 2019. Iraq, is that a war? Well, it's got elements of an interior civil war, a popular movement against a corrupt government. Corruption, Jim. There we go. Iran, that's pointed out, December 2017 is when all these demonstrations started. We even covered that last year. I think I've written about 3 columns on Iranian. And the third one is not very long, the one that I just mentioned in a paragraph. But those are pretty insistent. And yes, you hear this now in the open. It's so prevalent they can't shut it down. They don't want the Islamic revolutionary regime anymore. Why? It's crooked, utterly crooked, and all they do is take the money that they got from that piece of slop, the nuclear deal, supposedly, and then they spin it on wars in Yemen and Syria. They didn't rebuild or put it into infrastructure, and infrastructure meaning, in this case, there are half dozen good-sized cities in Iran right now that have intermittent water or even polluted water because they haven't taken care of their water systems. There's a situation, it's been somewhat mitigated, but during the summer, where they were bringing in water from Iraq into a couple of Western Iranian cities. And does Iraq have water? Yeah, actually it does. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So those were 2. I also mentioned Algeria, even though that's been pretty bloodless. It's fascinating to watch this long running, really since last February, series of continual demonstrations. Again, why? The government's crooked. It's a common theme here, and I mentioned Hong Kong prominently. Also, Venezuela and Bolivia. Now, Venezuela is a stalled civil war. Bolivia avoided one, but what was the problem? What's the problem in both of those places? Bolivia, a fraudulent election by Evo Morales, the socialist president, who was trying to make himself president for life, and he wasn't strong enough to maintain security control, and therefore ultimately resigned. He's now in exile in Mexico. But it's government corruption. And Venezuela, well, you've got an utterly failed dictatorship that's as crooked as it can be. It's maintained in power because Maduro has a security apparatus advised, and in some cases funded by Russia and Cuba. China's also active there, and Venezuela. And that's what I covered in that column. I could have included Burundi and Congo. Congo still got 4 or 5 little wars that take a half dozen to a dozen lives a week. So over the period of a year, you're going to have 500 people, 600 people. It's no longer 8,000 to 10,000, but over the year, 600, 800, 1,000 people killed in these small conflicts. Burundi's a frozen civil war. And it's likely to explode again. And they have protests going on in both Congo and Burundi. Congo, they tend to be ignored. In Burundi, they're put down by the government. So I didn't include them because of the absolutely fractious nature in both Congo and Burundi, but they have the potential for exploding into something larger than they are right now. Jim covered Afghanistan, and Yemen continues, Dan. There's all these moves, diplomatic moves, and they've been going on really since mid 2018 to come to some kind of new agreement, a new settlement, so that everybody can kind of sort of withdraw the Houthis to their mountain fastness and extract something out of the oil industry, and the Southerners can be placated. I'm not talking about Aden and the area in the south, instead of becoming a new southern Yemen, and Sana'a can return to being the capital, and the Emiratis and the Saudi coalition can completely withdraw, even though parts of the UAE has withdrawn some of its troops. And Sudan, in the last 2 months, dropped its contingent down to about 5,000 troops, and they intend to have them out, if not by the end of this month, which is coming upon us fast, sometime next year. And part of that had to do with, I should have included that, Sudan was one of the protest revolutions that I covered in that column for this week. There was one that, if you look at the number of lives that were lost in the civil disturbances, understand the protests that ultimately toppled Omar al-Bashir. You can see elements of them right in late 2018, but it really starts to collect in January, February of 2019, and by April, amazingly enough, a military coup topples Bashir. But there were several instances of scores and 100 scores dead here, 100 dead there, and including that massacre of June 3rd, which was a huge mistake on the part of the security forces, probably done by Rapid Support Force militia. You can read that in our Sudan updates. They're a government-controlled thug gang is what it amounts to. That generated throughout Sudan a reaction by the civilians that ultimately led to this sovereign council, which is about half civilian and half military, and a remarkable prime minister, a civilian economist by the name of Hamdok, who's proved to be a very, very svelte politician. And it's one of the things he's done is withdraw the troops from Yemen because that was something that even the elements in the Sudanese army kind of liked it, but a lot of the people in Sudan, why are we doing this? Simply because the Saudis are giving us money? A lot of the money had gone to Bashir and his cronies. Again, corruption was is still one of the driving issues in Sudan. But I don't know what the entire death toll is. Maybe Jim's got a handle on it, but it's not talking about what's going on in Darfur. They're still having Darfur. The two areas, South Kordofan and Blue Nile states, still have mild insurgencies going on. But in terms of the revolution, maybe 1,000 dead. And rather remarkable, given that it's Sudan. I guess I'm saying that is one of the more interesting civil conflicts, because it didn't break into renewed civil war. Understand that there are two areas where civil wars are going on within Sudan. But one of the more promising ones, especially the removal of a dictator that had been in power 30 years. So that's got to go on the chart somewhere, Jim. It does.
Yeah. I think one last thing to keep in mind, and we'll be covering this in the Wars Update, what you're seeing happen in China, and to a lesser extent in Russia, is the return of fascism. I mean, I'm talking about fascism in the classic sense, where you basically had a free enterprise, a market economy. That's what you had in Germany and in Italy and Japan during World War II. But you had a dictatorship, basically governing under various, one election, one time, whatever. China has evolved into the same thing. The Chinese Communist Party, like the Nazi Party. Remember the official name of the Nazis was the German, the National Socialist Workers Party. The Chinese have the same thing under the guise of being communists, but basically they have, with the reforms in the 80s, they've created a free market, but under state control. Sometimes heavy-handed state control. But as Austin points out, when the state gets too heavy-handed in basically trying to mold the economy, they make it less efficient and more prone to failure. But China is the classic case. Like Germany, they're looking for their dignity, as it were, and they're also looking for, as the Germans call, Lebensraum, living room. China really needs it, and Russia's well aware of that because China has claims on most of the Russian Far Eastern territories. In other words, the whole coastal area, Pacific Coast area that Russia has control for over a century. And so the Chinese are basically have an unelected government, a market economy, and they're trying to use nationalism as a way to hold the country together, united. And, of course, that led to World War II. And the Chinese are acutely aware of the history. I'll give them that. They know this. I mean, there are some Chinese are throwing around the term Nazis in the classic sense. I mean, not just the I don't like you, you're a Nazi, and that was basically a recipe for wide scale warfare, because when you're basically depending upon loose control of a market economy, which means you've got a fairly powerful economy, and claims on your neighbors because you need resources, that triggers a war. In fact, historically, I did a book on this, back in the 80s called How to Stop a War. We analyzed hundreds of wars, and we found out the major cause of all wars was territorial, disputes. People, again, needed living resources, farmland, water, you name it. And even though China has got its population under control and it can't get it going again, they still have a huge population. They still have a fairly high poverty rate out in the hinterlands. And basically the local Nazis, the Chinese Communist Party, they're losing control. They don't want to lose control. They've done very well with their little racket. But these things don't last forever. And, of course, as Churchill pointed out, democracy is a terrible form of government except for all the others. Churchill basically saw, what we're seeing now, but in Europe. So the curse is still around, and it's back in China, and everybody, including most Chinese, don't want a major war to break out to basically break the back of the basically thriving, for the moment, Chinese fascism.
I think that's a good place to stop on that, Dan, because Jim's absolutely right. The thing is, though, if we're calling them National Socialists now, a lot of ways they've been that all along. They just played this game.
Oh, yes.
It's transferred saying, we're not Nazis. National Socialists. Yeah, you are.
No, I'm just pointing out. I mean, that's the classical, how should I put it, nonpartisan description of what what we call the fascist in World War II. Since then, it's just become a way to cuss somebody without getting censored on TV.
All right.
Right. Well, we'll be meeting next time. We'll be talking about what's coming in the next year in 2020. Talk to you next time. Bye.
Bye, guys.